everybody. Welcome to the last session. This is the Gender Development and Social Change session. Thank you for joining us. We have 4 presentations today. My name is Sarah Khan. I'm an assistant professor of political science at American University. I will be chairing today's session, and I will also be presenting. The way that we will run the session is that we'll have 15 minutes for each presentation, followed by 5 minutes of discussant comments, and then 10 minutes of Q&A. So we'll have half an hour for each presentation. And I'll do timekeeping and give people like a 2-minute warning at the 13-minute mark. To kick us off, we have Sheheryar Banuri from the University of East Anglia, who's going to be presenting a paper on digital bodyguards, experimental evidence on the role of personal safety on mobility and empowerment.
Thank you, everyone. Sorry, I'll just move over here so that, and hopefully I won't get feedback on this. Okay, thank you everyone for coming to the session today. I have to apologize for Farina, my wonderful co-author Farina Malhi, who is at the University of Bath and enjoying the beautiful British winter. She wanted to be here, but she couldn't, unfortunately. So I'm going to be talking to you about our joint work on digital bodyguards, experimental evidence on the role of personal safety. So this is joint with Farina and Zahra Aftab, who I know a lot of you know from Prince Mohammed bin Fahd University. So I'm going to talk to you about a few things. Let me first give you some information that you already know. So I'll just start with that. If you wanted to go from Lahore to Gujranwala, this is the Google Maps route that I pulled out about 2 weeks ago. What you'll notice is that it's mainly showing 2 routes, right? A GT road and the other one's not the GT road, the 2 main highways that go there. And it's, if you look at the time difference, it's not much, right? There's about a 9-minute time difference, depending on which route you want to take. The reason why I bring this up is because on the 9th of September in 2020, a French Pakistani lady at about 2 a.m. was gang raped on the side of one of these highways. Sorry to bring up a very contentious issue, but I think it's instrumental for this particular paper. She was driving to Gujranwala to visit her family, and she had her kids with her. She ran out of petrol. And then the event unfolded. Now, as bad as that was, what happened next was sort of beyond belief. So many of you might remember this. This is Omar Sheikh. He was the head of the police in Lahore at that time, and he held a press conference the very next day. And basically asked certain questions, including why did she take this route and not the other route? Why did she not check her tank of gas on the way, and so on. That, of course, led to a lot of protests in Pakistan in the height of the pandemic. Also, there's, if you look at Google mobility data and COVID caseload data, you also see slight upticks in COVID cases being spread as a result of these protests. It made, of course, international news. This is from the BBC, and rightly so. Omar Sheikh was fired very quickly thereafter. And yeah, that's how the events unfolded. Now, the thing is, I mean, and I don't have to tell many of the people in this room, you know, we've talked about this before, so I won't belabor the point, but Pakistan is amongst one of the worst places in the world to be born a woman. So this is some data from the Gender Inequality Index year on year, and you see some improvements. So high is bad, low is good. And you can see Pakistan was towards the bottom of this, or towards the top of this terrible ranking. It comprises of a number of indicators. We've talked about some of the data in Pakistan not being very accurate and things like that, and things being underestimates and so on. But some things are fairly clear, like the maternal mortality ratio, adolescent birth rates, and share of seats in parliament, things like that. So it's not always a happy place. This has, of course, knock-on effects on lots of different things as well. So this is some other data that I like to show as that's something that's instructive. So this is data that's coming from the Pakistan Demographic and Health Survey from 2 waves, 2012 to 2013 and 2017 to 18, where they asked parents of children who are out of school, what are the reasons for their kids to be out of school? And what this metric is doing is comparing the difference for reasons given for boys relative to girls, right? So stuff on the left here means the reason was more frequent for boys, given more frequently for boys. Stuff on the right here is the reason that was given more frequently for girls. For boys, need to earn and not interested in studies is far outpacing the one for women. For women, you have other things, including things like further education not necessary, but not safe is clearly something that's relevant here. Lots of times a reason given. School too far is also another reason, all related to mobility and safety in the environment. Okay, so there's literature to back this up. I don't want to spend too much time on the literature in the interest of time. I want to tell you about the stuff that we did. But it's important to just kind of say that mobility is really, really important. Access to public spaces is really, really important. It has all these effects on things including health and well-being, and also access to essential services and autonomy in general. Okay. Now, how mobility happens in Pakistan, again, I don't have to spend too much time on this because for this audience, most of you know this already, but more often than not, you need a head of household permission to leave the house. You often would need a chaperone, somebody to take you someplace because, again, it's not safe. And so a lot of times what that culminates in is that women make fewer and shorter trips outside the home. Safety, of course, rates highly in this. So in Lahore, for example, 40% of report neighborhoods are unsafe for women. And then, of course, it has impact on educational opportunities and employment opportunities later on. Generally has poorer economic outcomes for women. Okay, so the research question that we're asking in this paper is how we can try and move the needle on mobility and how mobility really works. And what we're going to do is leverage an app that was made by the Punjab Police in conjunction with the Punjab Safe City Authority. You people know, some of you might know this organization already. The app that they have is called the Women's Safety App. That was released quite some time ago. And but at the time when we started the study, it had only about 10,000 registered users, which, as you know, for Pakistan is nothing. That app serves all of Pakistan, and I'll show you what that looks like. But what we're doing is randomizing information about the Women's Safety App. Remember, the Safety App already exists. What we're doing is randomizing information about the safety app, and we're giving them, I won't have time to show you the video, but about ways in which they can use that app to protect their safety, okay, and what happens behind the scenes and so on. To working age women in Lahore, Pakistan, it is a very specific sample. I'm not claiming representativeness. Please don't ask me about external validity. Or ask me, and you won't like my answer. But basically, that's how we're doing it. So working age women in Lahore, Pakistan, that also own a smartphone, right, and are from low and middle income families. So that's lots of caveats there. The control app, so what we're doing is randomly giving some people the women's safety app, but other women are getting a Pakistan Citizen Portal app. That's also an application that's also produced by the government of Pakistan, federal government, not the local government or not the police, but it also has grievance elements, but of course nothing to do with safety per se, although you can choose to write on there that you feel unsafe if you like. What we're doing is showing respondents a video about the features of the app. We're doing that in both treatment and control. And we're supporting them to install and register the app. In fact, I don't like to use the word, but we're kind of forcing them to install the app, right? We just say like, look, please install the app. We also place it on the front of their screens and so on. This is, by the way, with complete approval, right? Informed consent, all of that. And I can talk about the ethics, if you like, that were complicated. We measure mobility. How we measure mobility is we use their Google Maps data. Essentially, we're bugging their phone. And it's true, that's essentially what it is. That's our main outcome variable. In addition to that, as like my friend Rashid Maiman says, we're also listening to our users. So we're using travel diaries to try and understand where they go and who they go with. So that's, and their mode of travel. And then we also have surveys on perceptions and household indicators at multiple waves. Okay. This is, if you go to the App Store, this is the Pakistan Citizen portal that you can see. You can download and install it. This is the Punjab Police Women's Safety app. You can also download and install it. This was from a few months ago, so it's got 100K plus downloads now. That one has more, 5 million downloads. This is what it looks like. The main feature of this app, it's got quite a few, it's got live chat and stuff as well, but the main feature is these alert buttons. What they do, it's very discreet. You pull up the app, you hit the alert button, it sends your GPS location to the Punjab Police, who deploy the Dolphin Force over to those GPS coordinates, and their promise is that they will reach there within 10 minutes of you pressing the button. In the test that we did, it was not 10 minutes, it was 20 minutes, but they did arrive. So that was there. No questions asked, and they'll intervene. Okay, so how we did the study is we first conduct the baseline. We were targeting about 900 households. We got pretty close, 888. Informed consent, so there is incentive to participate. We do offer them a little bit of money as they participate in the study. We start bugging their phones immediately. And we tell them that, right? So what we're doing is we're installing another user ID on their Google Maps, which will allow us access to download their data. They still have to approve it. Anytime we ask to download, they get a notification on their phone. They can approve it or reject it. So they still have control over that mobility data. Of course, we went door to door, asked women to participate. Lots of women, 888 households said yes. Then they went back and told people in the household, and the people in the household said no, right? So we have a lot of attrition that goes from baseline to intervention. Intervention is when we show them the video, install the women's safety app on their phone. We've got about 319, so big attrition numbers there. And then from intervention to midline and endline, there's still attrition, but fairly low. And here's a sense of the timeline. So we started it in mid-22, and the study ended in December 23. Okay. One thing I will say quickly is that we only randomized households into treatment and control at this stage, and we've got fairly good balance. I don't have time to show you the balance tables. Ali's seen it, and he can attest to the fact that it's balanced, right? He remembers. You remember. I know. Anyway, so we've got good balance, and that balance kind of trends over. So the attrition is not differential as far as we can tell. Okay, here's the main results, and the first, I'm just going to present a few graphs, and then I'll be done. So I'll be fairly quick. The first metric that we're looking at is number of trips taken by household. Now remember, this is Google mobility data. So anytime you're traveling from somewhere or the other to somewhere else, I'm going to pick that up. The time you spend at that location, I don't know. And I don't know the time that you spend at home. The only thing that I'm observing is the time that you spend or the number of trips that you take when you leave one location and go to the other location. What we're doing is for every household, we're just reporting the average number of trips per household per month. The blue line is the control line. The red line is the treated line, and here's the number of trips. And basically what you see is before the intervention, which was Jan 23, they're sort of running in parallel. There's a little bit of gap, again, attrition. Then after the intervention, they narrow down and span out again, but basically no detectable change in the number of trips taken as far as we can see. Here, you've got the average distance traveled per trip per household per month. And so again, blue line is control, red line is treatment, a little gap in the pre-intervention, narrows a little bit, but again, no detectable change. So no detectable change in number of trips, no detectable change in the distance per trip. However, here's where we get detectable change. This is the duration in minutes for each trip per household per month. And what you can see is before the intervention, fairly parallel, and then after the intervention, they span out with treated households spending more time per trip than control households. So that does lead to a puzzle. If they're not going further, if they're not spending more, how are they doing more trips? And so the travel diary data actually gives us some clues about that. Travel diary, by the way, we don't have pre-intervention. We just have post-intervention. So it's not a difference in difference, just a difference. But here, what you see is from control households reported walking on their trips, about a third of all trips were walked, whereas for treated households, about half of all trips were walked, which is consistent with this idea of not having a chaperone or not needing somebody to accompany you, or changing your mode of transportation by going with your brother somewhere rather than just going alone. The second bit of evidence I'm going to show you is the companions. So we asked them who accompanied you on that trip. These are the number of trips taken alone by control households. That's about half. By treated households, significant at 10% is about 60%. And then we have some heterogeneity-based stuff that I'm happy to talk about in the intervention. I'm just going to leave that there. Thank you very much.
So we'll move to, we'll turn it over to Rihab for discuss and comments, and yes.
So thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And I have to start by congratulating you and your co-authors for this brilliant piece of work that brings attention to the critical intersection of gender mobility and technology in Pakistan, which is an area that remains largely underexplored. And indeed, any discussion on governance and inclusion would be incomplete without addressing women's public participation and mobility. Kudos to the authors for doing so successfully while also exploring more complex societal mechanisms and negotiations, such as trust in authority and the relationship between citizens and institutions. Now, the paper offers several strengths and contributions, but I want to begin by highlighting the core reality that it captures, just how difficult it is for women to move around. As the paper shows, women's mobility is constrained by overcrowded wagons and underpopulated spaces, by streets that are too public to feel safe or too private to ensure visibility, by roads that are unlit, destinations too far, or options that are simply too few. Household income adds another layer of restrictions. Too low and unsafe roads or costly public transport become barriers. Too high, and women face reduced legitimate reasons to leave their homes. For women to travel, streets must be lit, transport must be reliable, destinations must be near, or they must move in clusters for protection. Some argue that women fear too much, and some that they don't fear enough. Too often, solutions focus on patriarchal fixes to patriarchal problems, reinforcing the structures that constrain women to begin with. So with this backdrop, a key strength of this paper is the critical focus on not just physical safety, but the perception of safety, because the fear of a threat, it can be as debilitating as the threat itself. So the Women's Safety app seeks to inform and thus reshape risk and safety perceptions with the idea that this might change gender norms. The study demonstrates that the app impacts women's mobility patterns, so women who trust the police are more likely to take walking trips, go out unaccompanied, and spend more time outside their homes. But interestingly, these women also reduce their number of trips overall, possibly due to reinforced perceptions of risk in their movement. Now, this leads to the second strength of the paper, which is questioning the role of technology. And Mazhar Wasim Saab did just that in the morning. So within the science, technology, and societies literature, technology is seen as socially constructed and co-produced alongside gender. Successful interventions must account for socio-cultural, economic, and political contexts, or risk failing to meet their intended goals. The paper provides a clear example of this. As the authors note, the interventions implemented by the authorities are only effective if the citizens trust those authorities. However, this raises larger questions. Is technology a stopgap measure, or can it catalyze transformative societal change? And how sensitive are designers to the broader consequences of their technological solutions? Another critical issue which the paper touches on is the intersectional nature of immobility. So older, poorer, and married participants take fewer trips. But I would also encourage the authors to look into the intersectional nature of inequality itself. The Women's Safety app is an intentionally gendered technology designed to improve women's safety and mobility. However, access to the app requires a smartphone, a resource owned by only 26% of women in Pakistan, leaving the remaining 74% who are likely more vulnerable to risk and gender-based violence entirely excluded. How can such interventions account for the lived vulnerabilities of the majority of women who cannot use them? Without a focus on systemic inequities and intersectional vulnerabilities, technologies risk being palliative rather than transformative. While the paper hints at the intersection between the app and broader patriarchal structures, it can go further to unpack unintended consequences of technologies. For instance, could reliance on the app lead to increased monitoring on women's movement, reinforce restrictions on mobility in the name of safety, or provoke societal backlash? Exploring these dynamics through ethnographic and qualitative research could provide deeper insights into the app's societal implications. And hence, the paper offers an excellent foundation to delve into critical feminist technology studies that explore how women interact and reinterpret, repurpose technologies to create new feminist solidarities and communities. Drawing on this work, the authors could further explore how the app could serve as a platform for women to collectively resist patriarchal constraints and reimagine public spaces as sites of inclusion and agency. The paper presents a very important starting point for this, and I look forward to seeing how this goes further. Thank you.
So we'll open it up to questions and maybe take 3, and then Sheheryar, you can respond to those, and then anything from Rihab's comments that you'd like to respond to.
Yeah.
Great. Let's start with Farah.
Thank you, Sheheryar. This is fascinating. So I have a hypothesis, and I wonder if you have data to check that. My hypothesis is that this is, and I think this is following Rihab's point, that this is substituting for some other paternalistic overview, is that the family is thinking, oh, you know, she can go out alone because now I know she's being tracked another way. And so I'm really curious on the women who drop out also. So you go from 888 to 300 something, but where are the women who drop out? Are there in areas where we can figure out that this kind of a mechanism is working? Do we know anything about the areas and where the walking distance increased, I think maybe that's captured in your heterogeneity, which we didn't have time for today, but is it that it's in areas like DHA where we can be relatively certain that if I press a button, someone is going to come, versus if I'm in an area where 1.5 may not even take 20 minutes, they may take an hour to come. And so, and some of this victim blaming is more frequent in certain places than in other places. So I think you may have data for this. Perhaps you've already checked it. So really curious about what you find.
I swear I'm not mansplaining what Farah is saying, but it's precisely continuing from this conversation. Because that attrition from 900 to 300, and I'm thinking like, these 600 is really worth kind of probing a bit deeper on what happened at home that you're not allowed to participate. And I was wondering, thinking of the Alish and the Nasara's research of showing the video to the men to see would that change the number of people coming into the, consenting into the, being part of the research.
Great, thank you. Oh, sure. Oh, I think this thing still works. Thank you so much. So let me, so let me, well, take them in backwards order if that's okay. And that's also not a gendered thing, Miguel. This is a great idea. So we haven't actually looked at, what if there's any systematic issues. We have access to them. Farah, we also know where they live because we have their GPS coordinates and such. So we can look into that. That's not something that really occurred to us. So that's a great idea, and I think we're going to do that. And if you're interested, we can talk about that further, for sure. The other thing about it is substitutability of paternalistic overview, and I think that's a great point. One thing that I didn't say in the talk is alongside you registering on the app, you can also register a household member who gets the same alert coordinates as the police, right? And so that's a feature that they purposely built in because they're like, police ko trust nahi karte, or household member ko bhi alert jaye taaki kisi aur ko bhi pata chale. So that's precisely that point that you made, that they're kind of building in to that. So it's entirely possible that it's not even a police story, but it's just now I have my brother on call or my dad on call or something along those lines, or dad feels like I'm on call, so it'll be fine. Something along those lines. So we can certainly try and explore this further. We haven't looked at households that did that versus households that didn't do that, and I think we have data on that, so we can look into that. Thank you. And then lovely comments from you. Gosh, that's so, like when listening to you, I was like, wow, this paper isn't doing nearly as many things as we would like it to do. But it is true that, I mean, for us, it did open up a big research agenda. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen in this area. Not necessarily something in economics we unfortunately always deal with. So we thought it was really, really important. And taking a leaf from, like, economic activity happens somewhere, right? And so we're trying to tackle this issue and go a little bit deeper into that. So if anybody wants to work together on more stuff, I'm happy to talk through. At least I figured out how to bug people's phones now. So that's, I think, a technology worth your time. Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Yeah.
Hello, first of all, amazing presentation. While I do believe that this application has huge potential to increase safety, public visibility, make women more mobile, one caveat I think is worth exploring is the fact that applications like these have the potential to become mediums of surveillance. So do you think, which is precisely why I think the attrition needs to be investigated, do you think these women that have dropped out are sort of going through a trade-off between safety and surveillance? And if so, then how can we investigate that trade-off? Thank you.
This was
was really amazing. So I was just thinking, if building on the point that was made a bit earlier, how about clubbing this intervention with light touch information intervention for the entire family? So the entire family also knows what's happening and the mistrust issues can be alleviated. And so have you thought about it, or is there something that has been done? So I would really like to know that.
Thank you.
And then here I could use my privilege and put myself on the queue. I was wondering about another potential source of heterogeneity beyond kind of the income composition of the different areas is just kind of what they look like physically in space, right? And so what places look more walkable and dense, and whether there's spatial features that are predictive of where that switch from private, it looks like a switch from private transport use to walking, where that's possible, and whether that's where your effects are concentrated. And then we have another question in the back, and that'll be the last one.
Hi, thank you. So it's kind of related to what she's saying. But I was wondering, because you had two data sources. One is you got data from Google Maps and other is high-frequency travel diaries. Did you notice any discrepancies between the two data sets, and how did you tackle those? I'm really interested in knowing this because I was just wondering that, considering the real-life limitations that we face in terms of this data, especially in a place like Lahore where we have so many connectivity issues and recurring algorithmic patterns, how did you account for such systemic differences between the data sources? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We're short on time, but I'll do a quick. Okay. Stop me whenever, please. Thank you. So discrepancies within the data. So yes, there are, particularly on mode of transportation. So I said we didn't start with the travel diaries. One of the reasons was that when we started looking into the Google mobility data at scale, we realized that it does give you a mode of transportation, but it's very probabilistic and extremely noisy. So it'll say like walking versus cycling versus sitting in a car or sitting in a public bus. It actually has no real idea. It's just trying to make a probabilistic guess. And those models are actually for the US and the UK more so than Pakistan. So that data was particularly noisy. That's why we said, okay, we need travel diaries to understand this. The data are correlated more or less around that same period. We get not dead on or anything like that. The travel diaries have different frequencies and things like that, and people only remember big trips. They don't remember small trips. But there is a weak correlation, and the number of trips is very noisy in the travel diary data. But so it's something to suggest that travel diaries could be a reasonable substitute, but I wouldn't go that far, I think. The income composition of the area, Sarah, I mean, that's a great point. So we selected low and middle income neighborhoods in Lahore. And Farina is from Lahore, so she can better answer this than I can. But we can certainly look into whether or not certain areas are more walkable or dense. And I think we haven't done that yet. So we'll do that. I think that's a great idea. Thank you. Intervening for the entire family is good. I'll say on the mediums of surveillance as well. When we first approached women. So the 888 come from women who agreed to be in the sample in the first instance. So they said yes, and then later on, after they went to their family members or whatever or thought about it, they then said no. Now, what I don't know is I don't have information on women that said no up front, and I think that's something that's worth knowing. So that is not something I know, but that would be worth investigating, certainly. And then intervention to the family, I think, is an important aspect of this, and that's not what we were thinking about in the first instance, but we'll try and do that next time round if we get money. To do this. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So I believe I am next, so I will be responsible for my own timekeeping, so you'll have to trust me. All right. Thank you, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here with my co-authors, Ali Chima and Shandana Khan Momin, Soledad Priliman, who is not here, and also members of our research team, Aisha, Sharmeen, and Rida are in the room to present to you very preliminary findings from this project on women's action committees and local services in Lahore, Pakistan. So this project, by way of background, is one of 5 randomized controlled trials that was conducted through what is called the EGAP Meta-KEDA initiative, the goal of which is to test the impact of interventions that share a common theory of change across various contexts. And even though these interventions share common theories of change, they have adapted design and implementation across contexts. And so the intervention that I'm going to be talking to you about today took place in Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, Nigeria, Malawi, and Vietnam. I'm going to be focusing on Pakistan. But the goal of having these harmonized, randomized controlled trials is in effort to address external validity concerns that often arise with field experiments about being able to generalize across contexts from a single study. So that's kind of the background of the field experiment. But the background of the substance of what we're doing goes back much further. And I have a quote here from when I was doing my dissertation fieldwork in Lahore and Faisalabad from an interview at the Punjab Local Government and Community Development Department. And I think I presented this at LUMS in 2017 at a conference. And I just love this quote because this guy says, when I built my house, I didn't ask my wife where to put the fan in the kitchen. If I'd asked her, I would have known not to put it where I did. This is the state of women's representation in local planning. And it highlights to us a number of features of this issue, which is that women have specialized knowledge about particular areas that's rooted in the gendered division of labor. And so this idea that a woman would know where the fan in the kitchen should go, and that is known to this person, and yet that voice and perspective is willfully ignored. And so with that background, that is also supported by what we find in work that Shandana, Ali, and I have been doing in Lahore prior to this project. So in a survey conducted in 2018, we found huge gender gaps in the extent to which men and women simply say that they discuss politics, right? So 70% of women in, and this is a sample of 2,500 households across 94 union councils in Lahore, which were randomly sampled, 70% of women say that they never discuss politics. Among people who attended a community meeting in the last year, so like an informal neighborhood community meeting, there's a huge gender gap. Whether they contacted their UC chairman or counselor, this is 2018, so those actually existed, and then whether they think that their local counselor knows them. Right? And so you have women here in red, and just across these measures, you can see large gender gaps. And so what this study is trying to do then is to ask, how can women be mobilized to participate in processes to improve local service provision? And so we're thinking about the local level of governance and local service provision here. And specifically, the question that we ask in the RCT, in the field experiment, is to look at the effectiveness of a group empowerment training intervention that is targeted at the psychological constraints to participation. Can this type of training work to improve participatory outcomes in this local service provision context? So let me say a little bit about kind of what is the welfare-based motivation for improving women's participation, right? And so it's something that we can care about inherently in and of itself, But from a welfare-based perspective, what we also know, and we have data on this from Lahore as well, but also from sub-Saharan Africa, from India, that men and women have diverging priorities and preferences over public goods and services. And again, those are often rooted in the gendered division of household labor. And in political science, there has been kind of this understanding that when women participate, policy and distributive outcomes will shift in line with those preferences. And this theoretical prediction comes from rigorous study of what happened after suffrage was extended in the United States. So policy did shift in line with women's preferences. But there's newer work that shows that those effects were strongest in places where suffragist movements were strongest. So it's not just about participation leading as a pathway to representation, but participation that's reflective of these preferences. And so along with improving levels of participation, we need to be thinking not just about individual participation as an outcome, but also opportunities for women to coordinate collective preferences and coordinate on collective action. And so that is kind of the broken link in when we think about how do we get from participation to substantive representation of preferences. So the existing evidence that we have on women's participation in terms of the constraints, and there are many, includes the access to key resources to participate, cultural and social norms, gatekeeping of women's participation, and then also these psychological internalized constraints about the sense of efficacy you have about participating. And while we have kind of a better understanding of the earlier ones, these psychological constraints are less well studied and understood. And in terms of pathways to change, again, we have evidence on these earlier constraints and less so on these psychological constraints. So that is kind of where the study is coming in. So what is the intervention? The starting point of the intervention that we study is that resources are necessary but insufficient to participate. And this kind of parallels Kabir's conception of empowerment, which thinks about resources, agency, and achievements together, right? And often what we see is empirical work that looks at whether resources produce agency, but not interventions that directly are targeting agency. So that's where this is somewhat different. So this training intervention targets building collective agency among women while also delivering a resource-based component. And I'll say what that looks like in the experimental design in a moment. And then our measurement is tied to achievements in participation levels and qualities as the outcome. The intervention builds on the social identity model of collective action that sees these three preconditions for group-based collective action. And here the group that we're talking about is women acting as women. So group identification beyond just, categorization, kind of a strength of identifying with a group identity, the perception of injustice against that group, and the perceived efficacy, both collective as a group and self, about the ability to change that perceived injustice. So the experimental design that we have here is that there are 180 women's actions committees that were formed across Lahore as part of this intervention. 90 of these were randomly assigned to treatment and 90 were kept as placebo. All groups received a first informational meeting, basically providing resources on how to participate. And this was information, in this case, on different types of helplines and the contact information of local intermediaries and the union council, where even though local government is defunct, you can still have basic functions that the union council still performs. So delivering this information was kept constant across treatment and placebo. So we see this as kind of resources provided to both the treatment and the placebo. And then the treatment WACs received 4 further training sessions, which reflect those mechanisms that I talked about with the social identity model of collective action. So this is kind of broadly the theory of change, that this randomized treatment, this training, is going to positively impact levels as well as quality of participation that will ultimately also help with responsiveness, though I won't be talking about that as much today. And the mechanisms that this works through are these social identity model of collective action mechanisms that I spoke about, but you could also see this treatment affecting things that are not covered by that model. So I won't get too much into this, but I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A. In terms of our outcome measures, how do we assess whether this training worked? One set of outcomes is behavioral and costly. So the main way that we measure participation is through actually running a separate community grants competitive program to which these women are eligible to submit applications for service improvements within their communities. We observe those applications, the signatures, the content of those applications, and that's very rich data on participation that's also not subject to the biases of what's self-reported on a survey. And then we do also have survey-based measures of participation, but we mostly rely on the survey-based measures to think about these mechanisms that I mentioned in the theory of change. So I'm going to not focus as much on the results, which are very, very preliminary. We're still working through the data, but tell you a little bit about what we learned from the process of doing the work that our partner did, of doing the work to create these women's action committees and deliver this intervention. And I'll say a little bit about the participation results as well, but I want to draw our attention here. So the first is that mobilizing new groups in urban Lahore was extremely, extremely challenging. Initially, we had wanted to randomize individuals to be encouraged to join those groups, to be able to causally identify the effect on individuals of joining a group. And so we sent out invitations. This completely did not work. There was extremely low take-up. What ended up working was a process of network-based recruitment. So Aurat Foundation, our partner, identified focal people in each of the 180 wards where these committees were created to recruit women to form groups. And this network-based recruitment process resulted in most women attendees at the first meeting saying that they knew all or most of the other attendees, and 99% of women saying that they knew at least one other attendee. So pre-existing social networks were necessary to just create these groups. Another thing that we faced as a challenge was that this was about local service provision, and so we wanted it to be relevant to an administrative unit, right? So the ward as the administrative unit is where the level at which we wanted to form those groups. Now, wards might be administratively relevant, but they're not socially relevant, right? So people in Lahore can identify their neighborhood, but not the boundaries often of their ward. And so what ended up happening was that this recruitment was a lot more hyper-local at the neighborhood level. And this also ties in nicely to Sheheryar's presentation on mobility, because that was something that came up as a huge constraint to where these groups could just physically meet, right? So what we noticed from our baseline data, and Ali has worked on this in rural contexts in terms of the boundary effect to women's mobility. We see this in Lahore, that the neighborhood, as socially conceived, serves as a boundary to women's mobility. So women in our baseline reported having gone somewhere within their neighborhood an average of 3.8 times, but outside their neighborhood, only 1.5 times. Men in the same household reported going somewhere within the neighborhood 6 times and outside also 6 times. So there's a gender gap. But there's also this difference where for men, that neighborhood boundary doesn't seem to have a discontinuity, but for women it does. So what that meant was that our partner, Aurat Foundation, really wanted to have these groups meet outside of women's homes because they thought that that would kind of contribute to this sense of political efficacy. But what ended up happening was that the only feasible way to get women to meet was to meet in the home of one of those women that was in the social network. So the preliminary findings that we have from our outcome measure on community grants applications So this was, as I said, this was a coordinated measurement strategy that allows for this behavioral measure of the level, substance, and quality of participation. And this was advertised through meetings and in neighborhoods, and initially we saw very low uptake. And then we kind of did some work to re-advertise the program. But what I want to say in terms of the treatment effect is that we saw a modest 3 to 3.5 percentage point increase in the probability that a treatment Women's Action Committee member was a primary applicant or a signatory on a community grant application. So how do we interpret these findings? And this is the last part that I have. I'm at 15 minutes, so I'm keeping myself honest. The community grants application was a created opportunity for participation in the absence of formal channels. So we did this intervention at a time where local government was defunct in Punjab, right? And this was also a way to keep it comparable across all of those contexts. So a big question is whether this generalizes to other channels of participation that are not part of the program. We also find null effects on self-reports of other forms of participation, though this is preliminary. And I think what this one way to think about this is that first, it's difficult to move this participation, but also we need to think seriously about the supply side of channels of participation, because while we moved it in this community grants-based application, it might be the case that other channels of participation continue to be hard to access. So I'll stop there, and I'll turn it over to Sheheryar for discussion comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Great presentation. So just to say, I received a pre-analysis plan. Obviously, it's a very early study, so so I didn't quite know. So I've just got a brain dump here, and I apologize if none of it's useful. It's probably not at all useful, but anyway, just to help reflect on things. Yeah. So the first is. I started watching an Urdu drama recently called Kabhi Hum, Kabhi Tum, Kabhi Main, Kabhi Tum. Yeah, I saw the whole thing. Really, really well done. Saw drama after a long time. In the middle of the drama, there's one point where the protagonist sort of couple move into a low-income neighborhood. And the thing that's happening in the low-income neighborhood is every time they're walking outside their apartment, there's a group of ladies who are standing there with their kids running around and just discussing all sorts of things, including things like why the protagonist's wife is going to work, what she's doing there, why he's out all day, all those sorts of things, right? And those are all sort of, it seems very homegrown, but these are sort of mohalle ki baatein. And as I was reading your pre-analysis plan, that's the scene that kept coming back to me, because a lot of this, and not to get all Orientalist or whatever on it, but there is like hyper-local, just like you said, so I'm really intrigued to see that that's what you found as well, that there's these hyper-local we won't call them women's actions committees. Maybe it's just mohalle ki auratein gappe laga rahi hain, but it's something that's there and something that sort of informs your study, and you can kind of see it in that as well. So I'm really happy to see that that's there. I think that is a fundamental feature of our society. So leveraging that for the study, I think, is going to be really important. And I think that's really where a lot of the strength of your work is lying, because you're taking this sort of thing very, very seriously and actioning it. So I really love that aspect of it. It's a large project across different contexts with a common treatment arm, right? So we're limited in the amount and so I'm not going to say things like, oh, try this treatment, or you should not do this, do that. No, none of that's useful. But I think there is something to be said about trying to think very carefully about the inter-household bargaining model. I mean, I think there's no shying away from that when you write the paper, right? So because there is a big thing about effects on men as well as effects on women in the household. You've got a series of hypotheses about men's participation as well as female participation and how that influences things. So I think this is a great way to try and study that inter-household barrier and maybe test some of the theories there as well. So some of the people that oh gosh, I've got some names here, but you already know them, I'm sure. Abby Barr, Jean-Marie Balland, or Xingyi Wang have a series of models about inter-household bargaining that are really, really, I think that are going to be really useful. Maybe not on the poli-sci paper, but, because these are all econ papers, forgive me. But anyway, that might be useful to know. It's really great to have these projects at scale. One thing that I did wonder about was that there was, if I was right in understanding, there's no additional training. So those 4 sessions didn't happen in the baseline versus the control. Again, not a lot that's out of your control, but then there is, a lab guy is like, well, there's a contact impact as well, right? So just having maybe a placebo where you would have had just meetings but not discussed those things would be maybe a placebo. So something to think about potentially for a mean referee, not me, but like a mean referee to bring up. So yes, I wrote here in my notes, I said, is no training the right baseline? A purely behavioral person who's trained in the lab, he's like, no, it must be a placebo of some kind. But a development person says, why not? That's the context that we're trying to study. No committees versus committees. So I think that's perfectly feasible, and that might be the argument. You had a point in the pre-analysis plan about collective efficacy versus self-efficacy, and I really like that point, but I also wondered whether such interventions like these can yield polarizing behaviors, so people can either really go into the collective action model or just kind of withdraw into a complete self-efficacy type framework, and so I just wondered whether you could see any of that. I think there's less of that now because now, as you said, it's not randomly assigned. It's, you're leveraging a network anyway, so it's more likely to be collective, but I just wondered if there was any polarization. Let's see, many hypotheses, super interesting ones, but I feel like an intra-household bargaining model would help motivate a lot of the hypotheses, and particularly for the Pakistan context. Okay. I also wondered about the lack of incentives, actually. So about the focal persons were not being salaried or incentivized in any way. There was, of course, access to these grants and things, but I just wondered about that. If that's even sustainable going forward without facilitation, and the fact that we have sort of organic women action committees on the ground, right? Well, at least according to this drama. So maybe that's something to think about. And then finally, I really like your measure. So it's not self-reported, but it's a revealed preference measure, how much action they take. So I think that's really, really useful. And so kudos for focusing on that. Okay, thank you very much. Take question, or are you moderating your own, or should I do it? Maybe we'll take 3 questions. Do you want? Okay, I'll pick. Okay, lady, yes. Can we have a mic over there? Mic over there, please. We'll collect 3 questions, right?
Hi, thank you so much. This was such a fascinating presentation. I understand that you're focusing on group identifications based on gender, and anything else might be beyond the scope of the study, but gender does intersect with so many other markers of identity, and there may be inequalities and differences within the groups as well. So I'm interested in understanding the role of intersectionality of other markers of identity, particularly religious affiliation and class, and the impact that could have had on the women's participation in the groups, their sense of identity, and their sense of group identity, and their sense of group-based injustice and collective action. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Sarah, for that exciting presentation. And just following up on Sheheryar's point about organic women's action committees, did you find any kind of associations and local groups already mobilizing for public services? And whether you think that there was any connection with certain types of services, let's say water or gas or road? So just wanted to hear from you on that. Thanks.
The left side of the room is winning, guys.
Hi. So I had two questions actually, so I'll ask them very quickly. I wanted to know that you mentioned something about neighborhoods, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I was wondering the extent of spillover effects that you may have seen within the study within non-participating women. I know it's preliminary right now, so I was just wondering in terms of long-term results, if you're hoping that there are some spillover effects, both negative and positive, and how do you plan to account for them? And the other question that I had, I'm sorry if I'm asking too many, was that when you mention long-term effects, or when I mention them, sorry. So I wanted to know if you saw or if you intend to see any long-term behavioral changes within these participating women, particularly when they take political initiative. Is it only in terms of they need someone to kind of direct them in a certain way, or do you also see within these women that there are people who in the near future will tend to take action on like by themselves and kind of sort of be the direction provider or something like that within their own communities beyond the women's action committees? So yeah, thank you.
So thank you all so much for the generous feedback, and it comes at a really great time because we're working with the data now, and so these are great things to consider. I'll start with maybe this last question of the longer term effects and spillovers. So I think in terms of spillovers, we did think about spillovers within the household. And so we have data on men in the same households as women that we're going to look at on whether their perceptions about women's participation changed. Another thing that was interesting, and we don't have direct data on children, but something that came up, and this was something that members of our research team who are here noticed, was that in some of the activities, women were pessimistic about change in their own lives, but thought about changes in their daughters' lives. And so we have questions on aspirations for children in our model, which isn't really directly a spillover in the same way, but thinking about kind of long-term effects. So we haven't looked at that rigorously yet, but we are thinking about how this could affect other members of the household. And then inequalities within groups. So this is fascinating, and I think it's definitely something that we're interested in looking at. One of the things, and that we're interested in also is these groups were taking place in part. Some of the trainings were in the lead up to the election, and so political polarization within the groups could also be something. So we're definitely thinking about this, and thank you for the comment. And then this question of kind of whether there's organic women's committees, and this also gets to Sheheryar's really nice observation. I'll have to watch the drama. I think that we saw a lot of variation in this, and that's actually something that we're interested in looking at spatially, is that in older parts of Lahore with denser networks and that are also just more dense population-wise, where residents have been there for a longer time, we see some of this, and we see very little of it in newer parts of Lahore where people themselves haven't been living for a long time. And so there's kind of heterogeneity in the density of these ties within the city. So I think that's a direction that we're excited about. And thank you, Sheheryar, for pushing us on the intra-household bargaining. I think that's really important. And I will say that one thing from the data that we have is that about 20% of the women in our baseline said that the men in their households were either unsupportive or didn't know that they had come to the meeting. and so, that's a small proportion, but it's an interesting group to think about. And luckily, we have done focus groups and qualitative data collection throughout the life cycle of this project. And so those are things that we'll hopefully be able to speak to. And then I will actually move us to the next presentation now, and I look forward to taking more questions and talking to all of you in the breaks if there are more questions. So next we have Rihab. I'll queue up your slides for you.
So can everyone hear me? Yes. So thank you, everyone, for coming to this session. I feel like I need to begin with a caveat. So I have a background in engineering and the humanities with a touch of sociology put into the mix, but I'm not an economist. So please bear with me if I'm presenting from a slightly different angle, but I'm very grateful to be here to learn from all of you. So the title of my talk is Feminizing Infrastructure Development, a Socio-Spatial Analysis of the Gender Energy Nexus in Lahore. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging my co-authors, Dr. Hadia Majid, Rabia Saeed, Alaiba Fahim from LUMS, and Professor Charlotte Lemansky from Cambridge. And we're grateful to the Energy IRC at Cambridge for funding this project. So in our project, we are looking at the intersection of 3 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals to explore how spatial design impacts on the gendered access to energy. Now, looking at this intersection in Pakistan, we find that most energy and planning policies in the country continue to take a gender-neutral approach, which ends up being gender-blind, with no explicit emphasis on women's energy and spatial needs. We've heard a lot about this already, but unfortunately, Pakistan ranks 145 out of 146 countries on the Global Gender Gap Index for this year, and this has actually seen a backslide from previous years. And so clearly, we are not doing very well when it comes to gender parity. Now, when we look at energy and gender, most of the studies and development practices and policies in the Global South tend to focus on off-grid rural areas, or they take a binary conception of the urban versus the rural, in which the gendered and differential access to urban energy systems remains ignored. But in reality, the urban represents wide variations and complexities in its patterns and transitions, with planned upper-class formal developments often coexisting alongside the unplanned informal lower-income areas that often form complex infrastructural entanglements between what we can call the urban cores and peripheries. And so our aim in this project was to unpack some of the socio-spatial characteristics of gendered energy infrastructures in low-income neighborhoods in Lahore, emphasizing the links between cores and peripheries. And we also wanted to unpack some of the intersectional differences that were highlighted which relate to women's social identities. So we made use of 3 main theoretical frameworks, the first of which is an intra-urban comparative approach to explore the heterogeneous and relational nature of cores and peripheries. We also draw on Winter and Kabir's frameworks of women's empowerment, which explain this in terms of their access to energy-related resources, their agency, and an understanding of their rights. And finally, we take an intersectional approach to gender, so moving beyond a binary to focus on how gender intersects with other social categories of difference, such as income, class, religion, education, geographical location, and so on, and how this comes to define power relations. So for this study, we selected 5 low-income neighborhoods from across Lahore. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these areas, more so than I was. And we were trying to select areas that represented some form of peripheral urbanization. But all of these had grid-connected utility services and reasonably durable housing. So, versus temporary slum settlements. We were not looking at kachi abadis. And these 4 sites here were selected because of their close proximity to some of the core upper-class residential, commercial, and industrial districts. So as you can see here, we have Model Town, we have DHA, and Kot Lakhpat, which is a major industrial area. Whereas Gajjumatta here was selected because it has no proximal core area, but it is still well connected through Firozpur Road which is a major road network. Now, we used a mixed methods approach. So we conducted over 400 questionnaire surveys, as well as some detailed semi-structured interviews with women from these neighborhoods, as well as doing some transit walks and other field observations like analysis of house plans and spatial layouts. So coming to the findings. So I want to focus on 3 key themes that emerged during the analysis, starting with peripheral heterogeneity in women's differential access to energy. So the first thing that we found was that there was much more diversity and variation within and across these peripheries compared to the core areas, which tend to be more homogeneous. And this is because of the lack of formal planning and limited occupancy regulations that then result in variations in plot sizes and user types. And we also saw that there was a mix of very poor lower income and lower middle income households, and the income levels varied by up to 20 times. Although Gajumata was the least developed in terms of infrastructure and public amenities and had the lowest average income levels. Now, in terms of domestic appliances, we found that across our sites, ownership was less in households with lower income, with tenancy residents as opposed to property ownership, in households with less educated women, and in the control case. We also found that in terms of mobile access and internet use, women had less access compared to men across all sites, but that women in the control case had the least access, partly because of a lack of ownership, but also partly because of their greater illiteracy and lack of know-how. So from our interviews, we found that households usually share membership. Men have ownership, and women use it occasionally to talk to families and relatives. And again, for example, in one of our interviews, we asked our participant, do you use the internet? And she said, yes, to watch the occasional drama. We asked, whose phone do you use? And she said, my uncle's. Only he has the internet. We asked, have you ever thought about buying your own phone? And she said, no, I'm not allowed. Besides, we can't afford to have so many. And so when affordability becomes an issue, men's ownership is given priority over that of women's. We also found that women who were working farther away from home, especially in core areas, generally had better access compared to women who were working from home or from within their neighborhoods. So in terms of the second theme, we wanted to focus on the flows of energy and resources between cores and peripheries, because we found evidence of strong interrelationships between the two based on spatial proximity. So in our sample, we found that women who were living in these proximal case study sites had better access to employment, mobility, as well as to other public amenities like religious facilities, healthcare facilities, and even to parks and green spaces. But it wasn't just their material access. We found that proximity to core areas also impacted on women's energy-related know-how, aspirations, and understandings. And this was especially true for women who were working or employed in the core areas. So for example, in one of our interviews, we asked a woman who had recently purchased a washing machine whether she knew how to use the appliance beforehand. And she said, no, that is my employers, taught me. No one in our area knows how to use these appliances. We learn from our workplaces. I learned to use an iron. I've also learned Urdu. So a lot of these women are rural migrants who commonly speak Punjabi. I also learned to be more careful about hygiene. I learned how to make omelette, tender pops, and noodles from them. And so many women talked about how they had learned to use electrical appliances like microwave ovens, electric kettles, and even air conditioners, which, as noted, I don't have at home, but I know how to use. We also found that women who were employed as house staff specifically benefited more from comfort and cooling appliances, as well as had greater access to healthcare products compared to women in other occupations. These women were also able to access charities and loans from their employers, which they then used to buy their own appliances. So quite a few women talked about how they had been handed down or had been given their employers' old appliances on installments. Now, we've talked about women's material access, we've talked about their skills and their understandings, but even more importantly, we found that women who were in proximal sites also longed for more autonomy over their electrical appliance purchase decisions. And they put greater value to women's right to such decision making. So if you see across the choice, values, and norms framework, we found that across our site, women in the control case showed consistently less control, agency, and desire for autonomy compared to women in the treatment sites. So what does this tell us? This shows us that the exposure that comes with proximity to core areas impacts women's energy-related resources, their skills, their agency, and their perceptions of rights, leading to their overall empowerment. And our final theme was on finding some of these intersectional nuances between women beyond spatial characteristics, because not all women share the same level of access within these sites. So apart from tenancy and income differences mentioned earlier, we also found that women's employment status was linked to their electricity access. But there was a complex, almost paradoxical relationship between women's access, agency, and employment, which I'm going to try and unpack here. So we found that in the poorest households, more women were employed. And this was because their choice of employment was directly driven by their household's economic status and financial security, which acted as key drivers for women earning a livelihood outside the home versus staying at home. Now, while these women had less domestic appliances at home, their employment outside the house resulted in their improved agency and decision-making, especially around finances, and greater freedom of movement. And so employment served to improve their spatial access to energy. On the other hand, the lower income women from relatively better off households that were more financially stable were generally unemployed. And this was because they were either expected to or chose to remain at home under prevailing sociocultural norms. This then resulted in their less agency and decision-making and limited mobility, even though these women had more domestic appliances at home. So this raises a very interesting dynamic. Does lower income actually mean more autonomy and spatial agency for women? Because what we are seeing here is that lower income may actually result in greater spatial autonomy for women, and that having greater domestic appliances can be linked to lesser access in the public realm. Now, of course, this only holds true for this particular socio-demographic and might not hold true for others. And there are studies that generally show that higher the income, the higher will be the autonomy level for women. But it's interesting to see how this pans out within this particular demographic. And then just looking at some other intersectional differences from our interviews, we also found that women's household composition was also linked to their electricity access. So for many younger women in joint family households, they had very limited agency and control of their electricity use. And in the few interviews that we were able to conduct with daughter-in-laws alone, in the absence of their mother-in-laws, they talked about how they weren't allowed to use the appliances that their mother-in-laws did. And finally, religion came up as a key factor that impacted on women's access to employment, mobility, and public space use. So in our sample, we found that Christian women regularly visited their local churches and were more involved in community gatherings, whereas Muslim women generally had less access to the public space, either because of more stringent segregation norms, or simply because there was no space allocated to them in any of their local mosques. And so coming to the final reflections. So I hope that my study has been able to show that there is a spatial dimension to the gender energy nexus, and that we need more intra-urban comparative approaches to better understand the socio-spatial distribution of this nexus. But that women's empowerment through energy access cannot simply be understood in domestic terms and settings by simply improving their provision to domestic appliances, which is usually the approach taken within the development sector. Rather, we must account for their access and use beyond the domestic sphere, particularly in their electricity use and agency in their employment spaces, workplaces, and public spaces. And finally, there is a need to move beyond binaries such as urban versus rural or men versus women, because clearly there are intersectional differences in women's access that are shaped by their social identities, whether it's their income, class, religion, ethnicity, education, or even household compositions. And so an intersectional approach is necessary if we are truly serious about moving towards more equitable, just, and inclusive transitions. So I'll end here. I've put a QR code there, which will take you to a short piece that I wrote for the conversation a couple of years ago on the topic. Please do stay connected, and I welcome your questions and feedback.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Sohela for discussion comments, and then we'll open it up.
Congratulations, Rihab, and your co-authors. It was a pleasure to read the paper, partly because the way you connected the different bodies of literature, because gender is a complex matter, as we know. It seems easy, but it's not. And also the demographic that you were looking at, the kinds of women. And it's not always that because I work in gender and development that we connect the spatial dimension. We talk about mobility quite a lot, but not necessarily from that angle. So in a way, there is a theme that's connecting you to Sheheryar's presentation, right? And also to Sarah's. But what was interesting for me was not just the intersectional dimension, I'll come to that because it's hard to do intersectional analysis, but also the sort of the variation that you see between women's agency for those who were going to work and learning things and those who were staying at home. I mean, we know about that in a sense that when we look at employment and the kinds of employment that sort of generates empowerment or not, but it was interesting to sort of see in the paper how you connected back to then what changes. I mean, not just what changes in how you make decisions, but how people's thinking change or women's thinking change. And I think that's the psychological dimension that came up in Sarah's paper. So that kind of connection and analysis was very useful and I think people will benefit from discussing more. But it's also the challenge that you kind of talk about in terms of going beyond the domestic. Because energy sector for us, because women are mostly within the home or the main carer or the nurturer or whatever it is, you'll be using their appliances if they are at home, or without the appliances, you'll be doing that work. Because you're in the domestic sphere, or the kind of work that these women are going out for, a lot of them are for domestic service. So you're still within the private and not necessarily public. You're only public when you're going to your work. Or if in the case what you mentioned, like where else do they go? And that is also limited by the religious aspect and other dimensions in terms of where you go. So how do you go beyond that? Like your model is looking at what's happening to these women, and these are a specific group of women. But if I'm thinking from policy intervention angle, and if energy access is an important area to intervene in for empowerment, what would I be doing and you touch on it in the conclusions that we need to look at these dimensions, but it's quite important to take that into account. The other bit, the paradox you mentioned, and that always comes up in kind of poverty analysis, that for poorer women, your choice is driven by the need for survival, the need for what you need for the family, what you need to do, right? Choices have particular meanings attached to it. So if you're going out because you need to survive, that choice is that empowering, right? Your decision-making power may change. It may change over time. But what is the meaning of that choice, and how does the community interpret that choice when you're thinking about empowerment? And my last point is about, you touch on care, but you don't necessarily elaborate this in this presentation, and it's not possible to do in 15 minutes. But I would have liked to have seen it more, and I mean, the paper is very neatly done, and it's a pleasure to read. But if you want to challenge us and push us a bit more, then that might be a dimension that you may want to think of, because that is part of critical feminist analysis.
All right, we will open it up to questions for Rihab. Let's start over there. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for that. I'm also doing a PhD. Well, I'm doing a PhD in Women's and Gender Studies from University of Warwick, and I also work on decision-making agency. So my question is uh, directed to that. I was wondering, did you look at age of the women? You have covered all the intersectionalities, but age was interesting because I've seen that after a certain age, women tend to become the matriarchs or the same embody the same patriarchal things that we're sort of trying to get away from. Number two, the professional side, the professions that these women choose, you have touched upon, and Dr. Sohela has well. And my final question, would be: did you look at, obviously looked at the marital status of women, but did you look at the nexus or the pipeline of married women bringing in electrical appliances as dowry? Because that keeps coming in when I was looking at autonomy, agency of women in the household, especially of married women. And final comment would be, it would be really interesting to see I found that relative income of husband and wife is a more deciding or significant factor when it comes to decision making agency of women rather than their standalone income. That's all.
Thanks, Dr. Rihab. It's a great presentation. Regarding the access to energy and affordability, recently the prices of electricity have gone up in Pakistan. The tariff was as high as rupees 70 per kilowatt hour, whereas on the levelized cost of electricity for solar is very low. It is just 5 rupees per kilowatt hour. So, what do you think that giving the solar option can improve? And the other thing is the solar potential of Pakistan. It's a great potential. The solar potential of Europe is 1200 kilowatt hour per meter square per year. Pakistan is almost double, 2200 kilowatt hour per meter square per year. So if we equip the women with the softwares like Helioscope, they can work from home and they can make the solar projects design, and it will improve the employment of women. So your comments on both things.
Great. Let's take one last question over there.
Thank you so much. It was such a great presentation. And my question is that on the women who own appliances, have you seen how many of them had different financial access? For example, if they had access to committees or if they had access to kiste, and they can own appliances by using these financial institutions or different financial companies or local committees that they could have used to own these appliances.
Anecdotally, and from the interview data, I can say, this wasn't working? No? Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so from the interview data, anecdotally, I do remember that age, yes, is definitely a factor. So many women talked about, so in terms of mobility, for instance, young girls were never allowed, especially at nighttime, if they're, from their employment, if it's getting late, then they won't be allowed to come back alone and they'd have to depend on someone else. Whereas older women talked about being able to do that or actually accompanying their daughters, So definitely age matters in terms of what they're able to access beyond the house, but also within the house, we find that, especially when in joint family households, younger women were not allowed and weren't able to have the same access to electricity. In terms of professions as well, so we did some analysis, and like we showed. So I guess my main premise for this study was that I wanted to really understand the relationship between cores and peripheries. So coming from an architectural background, one of the key things that I've struggled with is how our urban planning is very much focused on a particular socio-demographic and these, sort of upper class housing developments with a complete neglect of social housing and low income housing. But the reality is that these upper class developments cannot survive without low income housing and the services and the labors that they offer. And so the whole point of this research was that I wanted to show that there is a symbiotic relationship between the two. And so we find that for women, it becomes, so they act as these human relational networks between the two because of the services they offer. So they benefit by getting income, and obviously we can talk about the power dynamics and what kind of income that is. But for the housewives in those upper class areas, obviously they are benefiting, and so it can be thought of as a mutually beneficial relationship. And so for women who were working as house staff, you could see that they had somewhat better access to electricity through, for example, having televisions in the kitchens or through being able to charge their mobile phones when they're there. So anecdotally, there was a lot of this kind of information. With factory workers, we didn't really find, access. Their access wasn't as flexible, and they didn't have as many sources, even to loans and charities, which was something that we found. Relative income, again, this is definitely something that we'll be looking into because, yes, I think it does definitely matter. So something for us to consider. The question on solar potential. I would recommend some of the other work that I've done on this. So in a lot of off-grid areas, we have looked at the socio-technical potential of solar, and not just solar, but micro hydropower projects as well in KPK. But we also designed a solar PV system for a village in Hilario. Hilario Pir is a village in Tharparkar district. So we were trying to understand that women who are the most marginalized in this country, who don't have any access to electricity or water, how could their lives be improved through solar energy? And we found that actually what mattered most to them was access to water. And access to water was connected to access to electricity. And so there is a nexus between water, energy, and gender that needs to be unpacked more. But definitely we need to move towards renewable decentralized systems in any case. In terms of finances, I can't remember now. I think we did have a question in our massive questionnaire on whether women were a part of, community organizations, or whether they understood if there were any groups or if there were any sources of financing available to them. I'm not sure if we analyzed it. Did we analyze it, Rabia? No, not yet, but yes, we did. Yeah, but I think it didn't make it into this paper, which was more on the spatial side, but definitely something to look into. So thank you.
All right, so our last presentation is Sohela from IDS, so I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. So it's a pleasure to be here. I am an MHRC fellow, but I don't get to come here because visas are an issue. I'm a Bangladeshi. This is a co-authored paper, and my co-authors, one of them is in the room, Shandana. Samreen is based at IDS, and Mariam is not here today, and Anjam is based in Nepal. But as I say, it's a co-authored paper. This is a product of collective analysis of 5 years. So we have team members from different countries present here who have contributed to the not just the thinking about the project, but also the analysis. So Mahin and Mona are sitting behind. I can see Saba. So it's a provocative title saying, "Do women matter?" Partly because that's something that you keep wondering as a feminist. but also as you work in gender and development and you try to make women matter to different constituencies. So a little bit about the project. What you're seeing in this paper, and it's not finished, it's a work in progress, we are still thinking about the problem, is part of a larger comparative project. And this project is on women's struggles against backlash. So what we are seeing in our countries, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan. So we collected data from 16 struggles. We selected them in specific ways. All the pictures of the struggles are outside. So if you have seen the exhibition, you already know what they are and what they are doing. And we are still looking at the data. The data has been coded in vivo. This is the question that we are asking for this paper. We have multiple papers with multiple focus and thematic analysis. This question came from our thinking around what's happening in our region, and is there a South Asia story? And in that sense, we were thinking and trying to look at the macro shifts, both macro shifts in the economy, but also in our politics and also in our societies. Because you can't look at gender without looking at all these different shifts that are happening. So that's the key question we are asking. How do levels and nature of political contestation affect the spaces that are available for women's struggles for moving their agenda? And we are basically looking at basic outcomes for the struggles we are looking at. So space for the movement agendas, and then there are varying states of political contestation in the 4 different countries that you see, and how religion plays a role in politics, right? So I'll come to that. But we have a typology proposed, and that typology, I promise you, will be provocative. So let's try to get there. So what's new? I've already touched on it. We started with, is there a new way of talking about the South Asian story? And South Asian story in terms of how we talk about women's movement or feminist movements. What we started with is how do we connect different bodies of work? Because feminist movement literature, a lot of it draws on post-colonial analysis. So if you have, for example, if you read Nivedita Menon or Srila Roy, that's where they're basing it. Gender and politics literature, on the other hand, focuses a lot on quotas. So we have quotas, women have come in, what's the impact, etc. So we wanted to go beyond, connect both of these, but also go beyond looking at South Asia, particularly feminist movements. The literature that's there is quite India-focused. So going beyond that and looking at the region, but also the conventional analysis that we see in feminist movement literature, and I'll come to that. For us, it was also important because we are looking at women's struggles, and one of the questions that may come up in political science is there's Tunan Weldon's work, which looks at, it's called Logics of Gender Justice, which looks at when do states respond to different policy agendas. And one of their findings is autonomous feminist movements are very important, but they also talk about different types of coalitions. So we wanted to go a bit beyond that. So what did we do? And this is for this paper. Data has been collected in many other different methods, and we can elaborate on that later in Q&A. So we developed an approach at IDS, what we called a gendered political economy approach. So it's political economy approach, but it's putting a gender lens on it. It's a historicized reading of the critical junctures in what happens in our nations and when spaces open up for women's rights and when they close. You also have to map actors because different actors have different interests on whether they want to promote gender equality or not, and it shifts over time. We, of course, look at formal actors and informal actors, so women's presence in formal spaces becomes important. So, for example, are they in parliaments? Where are the relative centers of power? Sometimes, for example, in Bangladesh, parliament is not the center of power, it's the executive. And then we try to connect that kind of analysis thinking through what our cases are, and you know the 16 cases outside, and what is their relationship to that reading. And data was drawn for this analysis from different secondary literature and also interviews with experts in the region and basically participatory exercise. We can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. Just very quickly, because I'm going to touch on literature. One is, of course, when we talk about gender equality in South Asia, in the development literature, what it comes across as these are classic patriarchies that we looked at. Classic patriarchy has particular characteristics in terms of how women's mobility is controlled, that you heard, women's labor. There is segregation of where you are as men and women in terms of spaces. There are ideologies that are built around female economic dependency. And of course, male authority is promoted not just in the private, but also in the public. But we see contradictory trends in South Asia, right? There are gains in women's education, in health outcomes, in labor force participation, if you're thinking Bangladesh. But at the same time, there are persistent inequalities, high levels of violence against women, child marriage hard to tackle, malnutrition. In politics, yes, you do see women, and we have had female leaders hold the top office, but there are fewer women in, let's say, key agencies of the state. You look at the executive, you think about the bureaucracy and where they are, in which sectors, judiciary, etc. What's also important to think through why these pan out in this way is sort of what we call in post-colonial literature, the woman question, right? Because as nations became independent, obviously before in the nationalist struggle, but also as nations become independent, there is a particular vision of womanhood that you fit. So in Bangladesh, it's the Bengali Muslim womanhood that is what is dominant. In India, that's about upper caste Hindu women. You fit that model, right? And it's shaped by colonial histories and the way struggles happened over this interpretation. And if you negate this interpretation, you're violently brought back in different ways. In all of our, in Bangladesh, Pakistan and India, Nepal is always a problem, Mona, is that you have the rise of right-wing parties in politics, and you have ethno-religious agendas in politics, and that shapes how much you can contest that woman question. So let's move on to the next bit. I'm going to give you a little bit on women's movement literature. So women's movement and feminist movements, it has a long history in anti-colonial struggles for independence. We all know about the NGOization of the movement in the sense that a lot of the time feminist movement is critiqued, that you have all become NGOs. Not all feminist organizations are NGO, but that has had an impact in the way things are done, right? And it's a contradictory impact. You have outreach at local level through NGO programs, but it has also depoliticized some of the agenda because you frame it in development sort of discourse, right? It's also very fraught along intersectional lines. The donor funding did play a role, particularly in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Nepal. Because of donor funding, sometimes feminist movement, women's movement is labeled as, oh, that's something, that's a westernized agenda, or that doesn't really, it's not authentic culturally. So legitimacy building becomes a key concern for women's movement. With the state, the movement always has had contradictory relations in the sense that do you work with it? How closely do you go to it? And formal alliances with political parties carry certain risks for you because it's the risk to legitimacy. So the question that I asked, do women matter? Particularly if it is going to be who's in political power and do you matter to them and do you have a space in their agenda becomes important. This is a very simplistic interpretation of what's happening now in our countries. Obviously, Bangladesh has moved away from that, but this is during the project period. The project period was last 5 years, so India, of course, BJP dominance. You see that, you see those assertions, you see Hindutva being promoted in specific ways, and that has implications for how women's rights can be promoted in what framework, and I'm coming to that. Bangladesh, we had Awami League dominance. It sort of organized elections that were not necessarily real, engineered elections, but the dominance sort of filtered into state machinery and other spaces. Awami League professed to secular ideals, so that's the formal space. Not necessarily that it was always secular in practice, but that's what they said, right? In Pakistan, you had emergence of PTI, and you have contestations that are happening between two parties, PTI and then, of course, PML, Nawaz Sharif. And both have a conservative vision of how women's rights are seen. And in Nepal, you have multiple parties after the post-conflict transition and elections, and you have a left alliance in power. It is formally a Hindu state, but in terms of Communist Party's agenda, the agenda is quite different. So what we thought is, oh, maybe we can try a typology. And this is just, we are trying it, we haven't tested it. So you can see on this, on that axis, it's about political contestation and are levels high or low. low in terms of you have a dominant party, right? And high in terms of you at least have two or you have multi-party. So elections are quite interesting. In terms of social contestation or conservativeness, what we thought was, okay, looking at ruling parties' agenda, right? And whether they profess to religious or secular positions. So based on that, you have 4 different outcomes. And I'll come to the outcome category in a bit. So this is the complex table. the complex typology, how it looks like. So if you have dominant party rules, and whether you are religious or secular, your space for women's movement agenda is co-opted and it's restricted in specific ways. If it is religious, the agenda is restricted in terms of whether you fit within that religious vision, right? So you have empowerment light. It's not that the party doesn't profess to women's empowerment, but it's a specific form or vision of women's empowerment. Space exists if you align with the ruling parties or the regime's view of that idealized type womanhood, right? If it is a dominant party ruling and you have parties that are secular or professing secular values, then you also have co-option, but that co-option is different in terms of development, right? And it's still empowerment light, a particular vision of women, but that space exists if you fit the economic growth, the development agenda of that. So then you can sort of push your agenda. If you don't in both of these cases, then you basically are outside. You're an outsider. The way you hold space is what we call being counter-publics, right? In terms of the other bit, the other quadrants, so if the contestation is high, so you have 2 parties, your space, if it's still a conservative agenda of the ruling parties, you will have a limited space, but it's opportunistic connection, right? So you have a competitive accommodation. So spaces exist if you fit within the conservative norm that's being promoted and parties seek with their constituencies. If you're lucky and you have multi-party contestation and then you have secular values held by the ruling party, then you have an expansionist space in the sense that you have collaboration. You can push parties' agenda, you can raise debates on issues that are deemed countercultural. So for example, bodily autonomy, sexuality, and other bits. So then that takes me to, we thought about, okay, if we plotted like our countries, where would they be placed? So that's how the countries look like so far. We haven't tested this out. We will have to test it. But we also thought, okay, can we test our cases? So the 16 cases that you see, we were also thinking, would they fit here? I'm not going to go into that because we are running out of time. Sarah has already told me we have 2 minutes. So there are many questions we are grappling with. Don't expect we have clear answers for everything because it's a work in progress, right? First question that we are grappling with, all the co-authors, does this typology work or are we going to get into trouble? A lot of us don't work with typologies, I'll also tell you that. The other bit is, of course, we were looking at data and different data sets. So VDAM, Gender Equality Index, GMI, etc. And we thought, okay, what else are we missing? There must be things that we are missing here. And what would help in terms of testing this typology? The other bit is, of course, struggles. You saw some of the struggles are new. Some of them are historical. So how far do we go back? We said project year, 5 years. But movements have legacy. So what does it mean in terms of when we say spaces for women's rights agenda? What kind of agenda and what are we talking about? And the last bit is, of course, we are looking at ruling parties, as you see, and their contestation over religious secular position. That's what we took as social, what we said as social contestation. But we also have we are debating over whether that makes sense in the sense that should it be social contestation? Should it be something else? Should it be ruling party? Are we capturing what we need to capture? Because social dimension goes beyond just ruling parties' sort of views on religion, right? So that's where I'm going to stop. Thank you.
So I'm going to offer some quick discussion comments, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So it's just such a real pleasure to engage with this project, and I love the ambitious nature of trying to think about a South Asia framework for women's movements. And so I'm going to raise 3 points. And the first one is, in part, what you're doing in this project is, as you stated at the beginning, like thinking with and beyond certain literatures. And I wanted to offer the possibility of looking outside the gender literature at the social movement literature more broadly, and particularly thinking about the dynamics of contention work by McAdam, Tarot, and Tilley, and the idea of a political opportunity structure, because I think that in kind of thinking about the South Asia specific framework, what would be interesting is whether there are connections with other social movements that have like kind of a regional, that have region specific dynamics. And so I'd be really excited to see you take that on. The second point that I want to raise is about, and I think that this is difficult to address in a project that's already doing so much, is how you're thinking about subnational variation in political contestation. And I was particularly thinking about the Indian case here, right? And so where you put it on the typology, that is sort of reflective of the state unit, but then the heterogeneity of competition at the state level is vast, and I think that has implications for regional women's movements. And you also have kind of the development of very strong state nationalisms in India and ethnic nationalisms in Pakistan. And so, how should we think about within country variation in this framework? And then finally, I wanted to raise the question of history and path dependence. And here I was interested in the role of the nationalist movements and struggles of each of these countries, and whether there is kind of a settlement of the woman question in the context of those movements that then has implications for how these dynamics play out. And there's a really nice piece by Valerie Moghadam looking at the woman in the family model versus the woman in the nation model of women's inclusion in nationalism, that I think could be nice to think with. So I'll stop there, and we'll open it up. Great. So, we'll start with the gentleman in the back.
It reminds me of my days at LUMS. I used to be sit here, so it's quite far. My observation, and within my comments, is my question. I really appreciate and really got excited about the way you've drawn data, secondary and some sort primary as well, but secondary mostly. And your observation in terms of variables that you have input. My observation comes directly from actually dealing with the political party since 9th May, and also their leadership, which includes women. So I have dealt with their lawmakers, provincial leadership, as well as their national leadership. And my observation, and I'm also representing one of them in a trial, and my observation is that a new set of variables have emerged. I will be shy away by saying it's a black swan event in terms of evolutionary of leadership within women, but I wouldn't say far away that it has actually evolved a new sort of breed of leadership with new set of variables. And this is where my question also lies. Have we explored that the leadership variables have altogether changed, as well as the structure of the spectrum that we are actually looking at? For instance, I've seen Sanam Javed, I'm sorry taking names here, Sanam Javed, Alia, Hamza, Khatija, and then I represent Yasmin Rashid. So the thing that I've observed is that the binaries don't matter now, because Yasmin is the most senior, she's 74, 75, cancer patient, who's actually behind jail, going through a process of, let's say, a trial process. So the binaries have disappeared. The new variables is chivalry, ideology, commitment to ideology, grappling with rights of to progression, civil representation, civil society representation, and some of the others that I think would actually throw away the past trends and as research and make the new ones more to be looked into. So within that, my question is, would you be linking this somehow or the other with the new set of variables that have emerged?
Thank you so much. That was a really fascinating presentation. I'm really excited to learn more about the project. I am just thinking aloud here, but there's something about the ruling party as the defining variable for contestation over religious and secular positions seems not like you're quite capturing what you want to be capturing. And part of that is because, it's interesting to see Pakistan. I'm not contesting where you're putting Pakistan, but it's interesting that we wouldn't think of the PTI or PML. I mean, we have religious parties in the country, and they're not the ones that are ruling. And so I'm curious if what you're really getting at is some sort of like state nationalism or nationalist project that is not being captured by parties, because what party would emerge in Pakistan today that would allow it to move away from the religious column? And I'm not sure. And I think also if you look at ruling parties, what I would be interested in knowing would be more about like the party politics at play, right? And so and then I think as to Sarah's point about sub-national variation as well. So I guess I'm not quite sure that's it. Like, I think the typology is really interesting, and I think you guys are nearly there, but I am curious about if something a little bit more broad there.
Thank you. Just continue. There's nothing wrong with typologies. I was just thinking is because you have data for 5 years of following these 16 movements, right? These 16 struggles. And I was wondering if it would be worth thinking of creating this two by two in all the different years. So 2020, 21, 22, 23, 24, because countries move to a certain extent within the typology, and see how are the struggles talking about engaging with the state, for instance, because it moves about, even though I agree with you that the contestation is there, but it needs to be more fine-tuned. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, so both Nilofer and Miguel, that was the last question, right? Is it working? Because we were looking at ruling parties, and that's not necessarily what it is, because we saw in the literature, like if you're a classic patriarchy, the space you're going to have is quite different. And that was something that we have been grappling with in creating a 2x2. So thank you for your feedback on that. That's exactly what we need to work on. The other bit is sort of, Miguel, yes, moving would be interesting to trace, and that's what actually is in the struggle data. So what we did was we sort of plotted this. We haven't looked at all the case data yet. We are starting to analyze in terms of looking at whether this typology holds. And we thought, okay, you can plot the countries in terms of what's happening at the national level, but then what happens for each struggle? Like if you're a labor movement, for example, if you're the ready-made garments movement, what it means for you in terms of your space is quite different from if it's a comprehensive sexuality education, which is the two Bangladesh cases I'm talking about, and what space you have. Or in India, if you're Bama, which is the Muslim Mohila, it's quite different for you than if you're the Adivasi movement. You're still marginalized. But that space in terms of contestation and what BJP's agenda means has a quite different implication. So we really need to look at plotting that and figuring out whether it holds, but also the case study sort of struggles have sort of done that for each year, and it has shifted. I mean, in 2024, it shifted even more. We stopped collecting data in 2024. Otherwise, this would be like a very messy typology. I just think about Bangladesh and what happened in July with the uprising. It's a very different kind of scenario politically, what's going on and the spaces that may or may not have opened up. So Sarah, in terms of your points, so the social movement theory, yes, we do have it, not in this paper, but that was one of the objectives, to connect the feminist movement analysis that exists in this region to social movement theory. Because there's also sort of a dominance of certain kinds of interpretation and a reluctance to engage with certain kinds of literature. So we did want to push that. So that was the agenda. And in a sense, then the political opportunity structures, looking at each struggles, and it's not just when do spaces open up, but when do political opportunities come if you have a particular type of coalition and if you have a particular kind of oppositional coalition. So the actor mapping was about, you plot, like who wants the status quo, who doesn't, who has power to shift, who doesn't, what's the network within these, and it varies for different cases. I think Chandana from the QCA paper, once we have the findings, he would be able to tell more about the strategies that work or doesn't work. The subnational variation, we thought about it quite a lot. All our cases are in northern India, which is a particular type of patriarchy, than if you're in Kerala or in the south. So that was when we started the project. We sort of said, oh, we want a particular kind of baseline. But yeah, regional variations do matter in terms of where you are and what do you do. So we are kind of thinking, oh, how do we pitch this if you want to look at just the countries? But it would look quite different if we looked at subnationally what is going on and where the space is. You also had a point on the last one. Oh, the history and the path dependence. Yes, in terms of that nationalist movement and struggles. So, for example, I can tell you in Bangladesh what the critical junctures are. 71 is a rupture point in terms of gender relations and what is the position of women's movement. 74 is another one when we have famine and what happens. Then again, Ershad's fall, 1991, that's a big moment for women's movement to get into the spaces and sort of talk about how do you sort of rewrite the social contract, right? And the imagery that you have of womanhood and what comes to the forefront or not. Particularly idealized womanhood and who matters. So each country would have those junctures when spaces open up, and we did map that. That's not in this paper, but we did do a timeline that's historicized in terms of how does it link up to what was happening nationally. For each movement, what the national moments are different when you can negotiate, but it's also the international moments. So for example, International Decade of Women opens up a particular space which didn't exist. So India didn't have a women's, like a report on status of women before 1975. So those things also matter in terms of what opens up and what is thought of as the nationalist kind of dream, right? So because you also learn struggles. It's not necessarily how we see in the West women's movement unfolding. It's a very different pathway for South Asian region, and the nationalist struggles are quite important. And it's not just the larger nationalist struggle, we also have struggles at subnational levels, and what does that mean? So yeah, that's a very important point to look at. In terms of your question, the new variables, Chandana, do you want to come in, or no?
I just wanted to actually stress just one quick point that might connect to three of these questions. Is that we, as Sohela mentioned, we do actually have a case-based gendered political economy analysis as well. So a lot of what we're going to get is from the movement's perspective. If changed variables or different spaces come up in their language, in their experiences of the last 5 years, then it becomes a part of our analysis. So it's not something that we superimpose within that. There is a very different way of looking at the state or engaging with the state if you're part of the home-based women's movement or the Hazara movement in Pakistan. And for them, what's been happening at the national level doesn't always make any difference at all, regardless of the state, which variables you're considering. And using exactly that, Niloufar, I think we totally take your point, is that what we're trying to define is the nature of spaces. And that space is more complex in terms of which contestation defines it. But to some extent, the level of political competition over those agendas, to what extent have they settled on an agenda that simply doesn't pick up
the women question, and to what extent is there space for contestation within that. So absolutely right, that is very simply defined, but it is an attempt at defining a space that will get bigger beyond that when we start getting into the case, the gender political economy of each of the 16 cases in the region. But this is an attempt at a very macro analysis that needs to come out of that project now. There's a lot of other more micro analysis happening, but this is our one attempt at taking the picture sort of to the regional level. Right.
Where?
No.
All right, I believe we're at time or over time, so we're going to have to close. Thank you all so much for your engagement and questions.
This.